A law that doesn't tell us what kind of data we consider, a law that doesn't tell us who's at the table in making decisions, a law that doesn't tell us what the plan should look like, or even that we need a plan. How and who and where and when and what. I'm John Comegno from the Comegno Law Group. Thank you for tuning in. We're talking today about the crucial, practical question of how do we craft consistent plans? How do we craft consistent 504 plans in implementing a law that doesn't tell us that we even need to have a plan? The Rehabilitation Act of 1973, in its Section 504, simply says, don't discriminate. You can't exclude, you can't deny, you can't treat differently on the basis of disability. It doesn't say you have to have a plan. It doesn't say we have to assess data to look at eligibility. It says don't discriminate. We liken our delivery of service under 504 to avoid discrimination to IDEA. IDEA lays out in excruciating detail what IEPs are, who makes decisions, and how and when, and what the titles are of those individuals at the table, even how many days prior to a meeting you need to send a letter home. 504 doesn't provide that type of clarity. We can look to IDEA for guidance, but we ought to be mindful that it's up to us. It's up to you. It's up to your district in making determinations as to what's reasonable, what's practical, what's relevant in developing plans. There are three key important guiding best practice principles in 504 and IDEA, and that's addressing individual need, plugging that individual need into a compliant process, and three, making sure that students are succeeding, making progress. For our 504 student, that's in the general ed. For our eligible student under IDEA, that's following goals and objectives set forth. That's their own road. That's their specially designed instruction or their special education. But with 504, that second prong, that prong of process, how do we figure out what that process is if the law doesn't tell us what the process is? Of crucial importance is consistency in forms, consistency in people, consistency in review, consistency in ensuring implementation. Our applications can guide us along that road. They can take that issue out of play. We need that kind of assistance in order to make sure we're being compliant with 504. Need, process, progress. Remembering that 504 is all about access. So in this segment, we're going to talk about how we get to that compliant plan. We're going to talk about best practices. We can first talk about decision-making. Again, IDEA tells us, multidisciplinary team, then eligible, IEP team, we know who's there. 504 that doesn't tell us we need to have a plan isn't going to tell us who makes decisions about that plan that it doesn't tell us we need to have. So who does that mean? Who should we be bringing to the table? Who and what makes decisions? In fact, 504 regs say, very unhelpfully, simply, quote, a recipient that employs 15 or more persons shall designate at least one to coordinate efforts under this part. That has led to the unfortunate not best practice of a single building administrator, perhaps you, congratulations, making 504 determinations all on your own. I refer to that as Lone Ranger decision-making. It's unfortunate and it shortchanges you. It shortchanges our educational institution in not bringing the kind of expertise and perspective to the table that can assist our 504 students in truly enjoying access in an included general education experience. To me, clearly today, the best practice is to impanel a committee. And I like the term committee. Whether it's a 504 committee or a 504 team, again, we can look to IDEA as an example, not as a requirement. As I have mentioned, you and your districts must set up consistent processes, even down to the faces at the table in making these kinds of decisions. What should be guiding that? What should be guiding that decision-making? Individual need. The need of the medically involved student is different than the need of the student who used to be eligible for an IEP because of dyslexia, but no longer needs special education. Is the nurse in the room? Why? Different for the medically fragile student or the student with diabetes or the student with a concussion. Let's be guided and let's have flexibility by the needs that we're addressing. Mindful that our goal is access to that general education experience, addressing the disabling condition, addressing the disability. To me, we ought to impanel a dream team. Who's on the dream team for 504? Student, parents, general ed teacher. I've asked you in a number of these segments, who knows student best? Who knows student best educationally? Student and parent knows student best. General ed teacher knows student best educationally. Bringing those voices to the table is very important in making sure that we're bringing the right kind of data to the table and making decisions. Student, parents, general ed teacher, nurse, our chief medical officer, administrator, school counselor. To me, those individuals are crucial elements of the team. Now, unfortunately, some of you may not have nurses in your buildings. And if that's the case, look to medical support in the decision-making process. If you have nurses on call or nurses who are available, or if you have contracts with school physicians or hospitals, if the majority of the time here we're looking at physical or mental impairment supported by a medical diagnosis or reflected by a medical diagnosis, we need input on our side of the ledger. Look to those individuals to provide support. If you have a nurse in your building, I encourage you to have that nurse at the table when we're talking about medical issues. Student, parent, general ed teacher, nurse, administrator, school counselor. From there on, we can off-road, considering the nature of the difficulty. Is this a student who used to be eligible for special ed? If so, perhaps we have a special educator at the table. Perhaps we have a special education team member, like a psychologist, at the table to assist us in interpreting data, to give us historical information about what has worked and what hasn't worked. There are even times when we need to look to a school physician if there are questions about the integrity of medical data being provided to us. Let's remember that a referral to 504 can be made by anyone. And let's not fall in the black hole, which I discussed in another segment looking at eligibility, the black hole that this is all about academic performance, because it is not. Our criteria looks to major life activities. There are thousands, if not more, of major life activities. Learning is but one of those major life activities. We may have a student with straight A's who's eligible for 504. Maybe she's got a twisted ankle. Maybe she's got generalized anxiety disorder. We may have a student who's failing, who's not eligible, because maybe he's simply not applying himself. We need to take that into consideration and make sure that we're not limiting our focus on academic performance. What type of data should we be looking at? In another segment, we talked about data collection, and we talked about being objective with data collection, and we talked about focusing on major life activities. The higher the pile, the more current the pile, the more valid the data we are relying upon and processing, the better our decision-making will be. We have some regulatory guidance with regard to data that we're considering, but let's remember we are not evaluating or assessing the student with specific instruments to consider 504 eligibility. That's IEP, that's IDEA. And unless we're sitting at the 504 table after we've evaluated an IEP student and no longer found eligible, or initial eligibility and found not eligible, we're not going to be considering that data. We're not going to have the benefit of our own testing. If we're looking at testing data that we've already completed, if we have it available, we certainly may look at it, and we ought to look at it. Otherwise, we're looking at more anecdotal information. We're looking at information that parent brings in, like medical information. like independent evaluation. We're looking to the source of our most helpful data regarding impact of physical or mental impairment educationally, and that's our general ed teacher. What are her observations? How has she provided support in the classroom? How has she accommodated the difficulty before? What has worked? What hasn't? Have behaviors impacted performance? If so, what were the behaviors? How were they addressed? Also, we may have data through aptitude and achievement tests. We may have data from a nurse with regard to physical condition. We may look at adaptive behavior. How has the student compensated or not before? And last and finally, we may consider social and cultural background. Is this a student who's a refugee? Is this a student who has never received instruction from a female teacher before? Is this an individual who's never been in a co-ed setting before? Is this an individual who is an English second language student? Do we have social and cultural issues that are impacting performance? If so, we ought to consider that. How often do we review eligibility? 504 that doesn't tell us we have to have a plan doesn't tell us how often we look at that plan. The best practice is that we come back to the table every year. U.S. Department of Ed Office for Civil Rights has told us that we may look at eligibility every 3 years, similar to IDEA. I don't think that's the best practice. We look at eligibility every 3 years IDEA because we have to evaluate, we have to test. There's practice effect considerations. There's cost considerations. We don't have those considerations for 504 when we're looking at anecdotal information, considering general ed performance. And we've got our primary observer of general ed teacher or teachers at the table. I think the best practice is to look at eligibility, look at the comprehensiveness of that plan every year, annually. Provide notice and get back to the table every year. I even think we ought to do this in the fall if we're having IEP annual review in the spring, and we may have the same faces or similar faces at the table. Safeguards. Again, since the law doesn't tell us we have to have plans, the law is not going to specify safeguards. We need to make sure that we provide notice to parents. We need to make sure we advise parents of their opportunity to review records. Parents do have a right to an impartial hearing, and the law establishes other dispute resolution mechanisms. We need to notify parents of those rights. We must make sure that we've provided written information with regard to those rights to our parents when our states often don't give us those forms. Many of our states, through our state educational agencies, have parental rights with regard to special ed available. We don't have the benefit of that with 504, so you should craft your own. What about consent? If I were to ask you when consent's required for special ed, you'd rattle it off. You'd tell me when. You'd tell me which circumstance. You'd tell me how many days. You'd tell me when due process is available and when it's not. And that's because our regs are clear. Our regs here are not clear. Again, U.S. Department of Ed Office for Civil Rights has opined that consent is required under 504 the first time we're looking at eligibility. Only the first time. We ought to follow that direction. I think we ought to do even better. I think we ought to ask for consent for implementation of the first plan and offer the opportunity to provide consent for subsequent plans, mindful that that consent is not required. Not required for subsequent plans if we afford the parent the opportunity to participate and we don't hear from them. Let's make sure if we are securing consent that that consent is in writing. So what should the plan look like? We started talking about a law that doesn't do this, doesn't do that, but tells you not to discriminate. If we don't have to have a 30-page plan, our plan ought to be focused and relevant. If we have the benefit of application, the benefit of software that directs us, this is not even a question we need to undertake. We ought to implement consistently that application with regard to 504. But let's be mindful that that 504 plan simply needs to provide a snapshot of our decision-making progress. It needs to explain what data we considered in looking at need, what data we plugged into our process to find eligibility, how we're going to review progress, which accommodations we're providing to enable access, and who's responsible. That's all. That's what we need to be focused on when we're considering drafting plans and implementing plans. Another very important point, and one that perhaps is silly for me to even suggest, we should never overpromise with 504. We should always be mindful that our plan matches our actual resources. Don't promise a related service if we don't have related service providers available to implement. Don't promise an accommodation that's not relevant in the middle school setting based on the maturity of the student, simply because it was on a prior plan. Let's make sure accommodations match actual need and actual resources. And let's also make sure that we're consistently implementing. What other considerations are important in considering consistent and relevant plans? Perhaps the most important, after we get beyond who's at the table and why they're at the table and when they're at the table, is a consideration of level of accommodation. 504 does not require us to change the educational experience. We've discussed that. Although certain courts and OCR have talked about FAPE in the context of 504, the law doesn't tell us that FAPE is the standard for 504. The law prohibits us from excluding, denying benefit, or treating differently. It requires access. It prohibits disability-based discrimination. It ensures the civil right. We do that by providing a plan in a consistent fashion, as we've been discussing, and providing accommodation. The question then becomes, what's the level of accommodation? Is the accommodation everything that's on the doctor's note? Is the accommodation that's required everything that might be requested at the table, might be demanded at the table? No. Your obligation, our obligation, is to provide reasonable accommodation, only reasonable accommodation, mindful that we're not expanding rights. We discussed in another segment the difference between accommodation and modification. Modifications change standard. They expand rights. Accommodations adjust. They adjust how a student participates, how a student learns, how a student shows mastery. Accommodations are a lower standard. Accommodations need only be reasonable. In looking at cases and looking at direction, what do we consider? May we consider cost? May we consider our ability to police, our ability to implement, our resources? The answer is yes. We have regulations that discuss what might be relevant, what might be reasonable. We're not expected to undergo undue financial or administrative burden or hardship. We're not expected to make changes. And that's because we're talking about accommodating, not modifying. Cases speak to reasonable accommodations as providing meaningful access. Minor readjustments, not changes, readjustments which don't create undue hardship as being meaningful and relevant and reasonable. Accommodations don't have to be optimal. Effective accommodation as alternative to specific demand can be reasonable. An interesting case coming out of the Third Circuit involving a Pennsylvania area school district in 2014 looked at the very relevant issue of allergy accommodation today. We see an incredible increase in diagnoses of allergies today. Are we expected to sanitize? Are we expected to implement what was in this case a requested 19-page allergy action plan to ensure no impact of that physical impairment, those allergies? The school district didn't think so. The school district took that plan that was demanded, that was proposed, shared it with the school physician, and respectfully declined. Instead, suggested their own plan, a plan that included training regarding anaphylaxis, regarding reviewing symptoms, EpiPen, epinephrine administration. Made sure that that plan was circulated made sure that that plan could be implemented, made sure, bottom line, that that plan would enable access. The court concluded that that plan was reasonable. Reasonable. Did not make changes, did not impose undue financial or administrative burden. So folks, in considering our practical issues today, in considering the why and the how and the when and the who, let's remember 504 doesn't change. 504 says don't discriminate. 504 says enable access. 504 says deliver reasonable accommodation to ensure that this precious cohort of students with physical and mental impairments can fully be included and receive the benefit of general education, just like their general education peers. Be guided by that principle. Thank you for tuning in. I'm John Camegno. Be careful out there.